It was the day after the 4th of July holiday in 1912 in western Pennsylvania. Folks were returning home after celebrating the 4th with family and friends, and that's when one of the worst tragedies in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania history happened. A terrible train crash that claimed 27 lives, many of them young children. That wreck in the Ligonier Valley is one of the stories of Appalachia.
You know, Steve, 1912 was a hopping year for disasters. Of course, Titanic went down in April of that year, and then you come closer to home, and here on the mainland in Pennsylvania, you have this terrible train crash that kills these 27 lives. And, you know, when we talk about train crashes, they're usually very, how can I say this? They're vivid almost, the way that the descriptions are and so forth, and the twisted metal and the way that, you know, bodies and everything else, people were found. It's depressing, but it's a fact of life.
Well, you know, we've told several train crash stories. You know, obviously, a few years ago, if you remember, we did one down at the Natural Tunnel.
Right.
And then just a few weeks ago, we did the one right up there near Jellicoe with the troops in 1944. This one was more tragic because you had children involved in this. And families and all that. And it was indeed a very, very big tragedy up there in Pennsylvania. Well, folks, on July 5th, 1912, just one day after families set off fireworks and waved flags in celebration of Independence Day, a catastrophic train wreck on the Wilpen Branch of the Ligonier Valley Railroad ended the lives of 27 people, many of them children, and injured 30 more. It was one of the worst disasters that area has ever seen. Now, when you think about a passenger train nowadays, you think of something like Amtrak, or maybe the high-speed rail you see in other countries. But that's not what this was 113 years ago. This was a modest local passenger coach, the kind that you might see on tourist trains like in Dollywood or Bryson City, North Carolina, meant to haul tourists up through the Smokies, not made anywhere near as sturdy as a freight car would be.
Well, that Friday afternoon, the passenger train was unusually crowded with picnickers, workers, and above all, children who were headed off to the woods to pick wildflowers and enjoy a sunny day up in the mountains. Well, the train left Ligonier Station about 3:40 p.m., and the mood that holiday weekend was, as you can imagine, very cheerful, with kids laughing, leaning out the windows, and waving goodbye to their parents. Yes, waving goodbye to their parents because this was supposed to be a short trip. Well, the coach, packed almost to the doors, was being pushed uphill by a small engine on its way to Wilpen, about 4 miles away. But what nobody on board knew was that massive coal train, or I should say a massive coal train, led by 2 heavy engines, was headed down that same line. That was unusual, since the Ligonier Valley line handled both freight and passenger service and had developed a system to keep the trains separate. Well, this day, though, the coal train had gotten delayed. 2 wheels on one of the freight engines had come off the track, and that set them back over an hour, scrambling to get everything re-railed and back moving again.
And Rod, that delay became a time bomb. By the time the coal train was finally put back together, it was already 3:10 in the afternoon. The crew was stressed, low on water, and behind schedule, with pressure to keep that coal moving out of the mines and on to market. The conductor made what seemed like a reasonable decision to him. He called the railroad office at Ligonier and asked for permission to head down the line before the passenger train left the station, asking them to delay the passenger train until they'd made the 4-mile trip. Now think about that. This wasn't just any freight train that could easily pull off onto a siding. This was a coal train up to 1 mile long. The Wilpen Branch didn't have sidings long enough to hold a train that size. And the only way that freight could get off the line was to keep moving and hope the track ahead stayed clear. Well, as we said, the coal train conductor asked them to hold the passenger train at Ligonier until the freight got through. Thinking that had been done, the train set off down the mountain with its load of coal on what they thought was a clear rail line. Tragically, that was not the case because just 10 minutes later, disaster struck.
At 3:20 sharp, conductor Charles Kuhn stepped onto the platform at Ligonier and shouted, "All aboard!" just like he did every day. He had no idea what was heading his way down the mountain. And this little coach, filled with children and picnic goers, started its usual backward run up the mountain toward Wilpen because there was no way to turn the engine around. Although there was a Y at Wilpen, this had become standard procedure on the line. Backward up, forward down, as it was easier and quicker that way. And at the same time, up on that very mountain, that massive coal train, so big it needed 2 engines up front, began rolling down toward Ligonier. That train had lost precious time thanks to those derailed wheels. Now it was trying to make that time up.
A large group of children had been invited to go on a little mountain outing by George Senft, general manager of the railroad. Their caretaker, a nurse named Esther Matthews, had nursed Mr. Senft back to health some months before. Now she was looking after his guests, and those children really took to her. They gathered around her as the train went up the mountain, along with other children on the train, happily playing without a care in the world. At that moment, the 2 trains met just around a blind curve near the Denny racetrack. Neither could see the other coming in time, and neither had time to stop. The collision was instant and horrific. That tiny passenger coach, built more like a wooden trolley, was literally crushed between the 2 freight engines and the locomotive pushing it from behind. It was like an eggshell caught between 2 anvils. The coach exploded into splinters, and not one passenger escaped either death or injury.
Well, Miss Matthews was considered a hero that day. Just before the collision, she spotted that freight train pulling 80 coal cars, barreling down the hill. Realizing what was about to happen, she sprang into action, grabbed 2 children, shoved them into the baggage compartment, and picked up 2 more to run for the front of the train. She was too late, though. The crash happened before she made it. Esther Matthews was buried in the wreckage. One of the 2 children was saved because she threw the child clear. The other she shielded with her own body. Miss Matthews survived, but barely. She suffered, back in those days, this was pretty devastating, a fractured hip, a shattered arm, internal injuries, and a deep scalp wound. But thanks to her quick thinking, at least a few young lives were spared. The aftermath of the wreck was total chaos. Farmers and racetrack workers rushed to the scene. One farmer sprinted over 1.5 miles to go get help. In the minutes, the whole town of Ligonier knew. People dropped everything. Businessmen, shop clerks, even holiday vacationers, and hurried to the curve where the wreck had happened.
Now it was said that mothers were screaming hysterically, running to and fro and wringing their hands in anguish, seeking help for their little ones buried in the wreckage. Desperate fathers clawed at the splintered wreckage with bare hands, desperately trying to free their children with little success. One elderly man stayed by the side of his little nephew, whose legs were pinned beneath the timber. He stroked the boy's hair, whispering calm until help could come to pull the boy free. Rescue efforts came in from Latrobe, just down the line, with whatever type of conveyance they had to get the injured to hospitals in Pittsburgh to assist the overworked Latrobe Hospital. Doctors and nurses loaded into a relief train and raced to the scene to help the injured. Frank McConaughey, the freight engineer, died under his engine, scalded by steam. George Byers, the fireman, was crushed. And Engineer Beatty of the 2nd Freight Engine broke a leg jumping for his life. His fireman lost both legs, crushed under the wheels of the train car. Death and mutilation did not discriminate that day.
No, it didn't, because by nightfall, Corporal H.A. McMurray had arrived with deputies to begin a coroner's inquest. They began that very grim work of recovering and identifying bodies. Grief overtook the entire region. Many of those children were local, Everyone knew someone who had been on that train, and after the rescue and recovery efforts came the funerals, which began that very next Sunday. Practically all of Ligonier turned out. So did summer visitors from Pittsburgh, who had come expecting a restful weekend in the mountains, but instead found death and destruction. Churches held joint services and an open-air memorial with the Reverend N.F. Boyer, pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, as the principal speaker. 4 victims were laid to rest that day. 3 services held one after the other, and the town shrouded in black.
Now, no one blamed the railroad out loud, at least not publicly. The pastors that July Sunday said it was God's will. Maybe people just couldn't bring themselves to add anger to all that sorrow. On Monday, Ligonier shut down in mourning. Stores were closed and no business was done that day. And the silence of the town said everything. In the months that followed the Ligonier train wreck, the shock gave way to anger and then to judgment. That September, the coroner's inquest completed its investigation. After weeks of testimony and review, they issued a clear verdict. The disaster had been caused by negligence that fell squarely on the Ligonier Valley Railroad Company.
Well, as you could imagine, lawsuits came next, and plenty of them. Families of the dead and injured filed damage claims. Most were eventually settled, but some cases stood out for their sheer tragedy. One of the most heartbreaking was that of Frank McConaughey, the freight engineer who died at his post, crushed beneath his own engine, scalded by its steam. He left behind a widow, Jane McConaughey. She should have received the $5,000 compensation awarded in his name, but she didn't, at least not directly.
You see, Jane was a patient at the Dixmont State Hospital for the Insane near Pittsburgh at the time of the wreck. The court appointed Dr. E. McAdoo of Ligonier as a special commissioner to examine her condition. His finding? She was incurable, so the court ruled that the money would not go directly to her, but to the administrator of Frank McConaughey's estate.
Behind the scenes, pressure was mounting on the railroad company to explain itself. The Pennsylvania State Railroad Commission launched its own investigation, but when they asked the company for details, how the trains were managed and what led to the crash, Ligonier Valley refused to cooperate. No accident report, no statement. So, on November 26th, the commission took it a step further. They sent the full investigation file to the Pennsylvania Attorney General, asking him to take whatever action he saw fit. Well, the pressure worked, somewhat. A few days later, on December 2nd, the Ligonier Valley Railroad finally responded. They reported to the commission that they had made sweeping changes on how the trains were going to be operated on the Wilpen Branch.
And Rod, what they did was they installed a new telephone line to ensure clearer communications. They opened 2 news stations where crews were required to report for orders before entering the main line, and most notably, passenger coaches would never again be pushed from behind. From that point forward, locomotives would always run in front, giving passengers some protection from any possible future crash. And yeah, that would have been, as you see, horrific. Imagine you've got one train engine on one side and 2 train engines on the other, and like it said, you're squashed like you're in an accordion. Terrible.
Yeah, and you know what? It's also an example of fixing the barn door after the horses come home, because all this stuff happened, and then it took these people dying and all of these lawsuits and everything else to kind of push the Ligonier Valley Railroad Company into, making some sort of change. But all of this could have probably been avoided if they had just simply ran things the way I guess we're looking at it now here in this time frame in the 21st century. We had the solution right here, sitting here talking about it. But they didn't have it back then in 1912. They had to work around it in another way.
Well, I think they got a little careless in this case. And, living here in coal country ourselves, what a mile-long coal train, how hard it would be to stop one of those coming down a mountain.
Yep.
You know, terrible, terrible thing. This, by the way, though, Rod, is another one of those stories that was suggested to us by a listener up there in the Pennsylvania area.
Oh, great.
And Rod and I are so happy you did this. This is a very touching story that we are so happy to tell. And folks, that's the story of the Ligonier Valley train wreck of 1912, another one of the stories of Appalachia. Thanks for listening. If you've not done so already, be sure to subscribe to the Stories Podcast on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss any of our stories of Appalachia. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.